Maybe tonight, as the world around you becomes quiet, you can imagine a time when the sky was not yet ruled by Zeus, a time before Mount Olympus became the home of the gods, before the thunderbolt belonged to the King of Heaven, before the world had settled into the order that the ancient Greeks would one day know. In that distant age, the universe belonged to the Titans. They were ancient beings, born from the earliest powers of creation, and among them was Cronus, the ruler of the heavens. For a time, his power seemed absolute. Nothing could challenge him. Nothing could threaten his throne. But even the most powerful ruler can be haunted by a single thought. What if someone stronger comes after me? What if the child I raise becomes the one who destroys me? And somewhere in the darkness of the future, a prophecy had already spoken of such a child. A son who would one day rise against his father. A son who would take the throne. A son who would change the fate of the gods forever. That prophecy would make Cronus afraid, and fear would lead him to do something terrible. But fate has a strange way of surviving even the greatest attempts to escape it. Because one child would be hidden from Cronus, a child who would grow far from the throne, far from the eyes of the Titans, until the day he was strong enough to return. His name was Zeus. And when Zeus finally emerged from hiding, he would not come simply to claim a throne. He would come to free his brothers and sisters. He would gather forgotten powers. He would call upon ancient beings who had been imprisoned beneath the earth. And eventually, he would lead the younger gods into a war against the Titans themselves. A war so enormous that the mountains would shake beneath it. A war that would last for years. A war that would decide who would rule the universe. So tonight, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Imagine instead the ancient earth beneath your feet, the distant mountains beneath a darkening sky, and far above them, the old powers of the universe, preparing for a battle that no mortal army could ever imagine. This is the story of the Titanomachy, the great war between Zeus and the Titans. And this is where the age of the Olympian gods truly begins. Long before Zeus ruled from Mount Olympus, there was another order to the universe. The gods who would one day become the most familiar figures of Greek mythology had not yet risen to power. There was no Olympian throne, no palace above the clouds, no thunderbolt carried through the heavens. Instead, the world belonged to an older generation, the Titans. To understand why Zeus would eventually go to war against them, we first have to return to a much older age. An age when the universe was still young. The ancient Greeks imagined the beginning of the world not as a quiet moment, but as the emergence of powerful forces. From the earliest depths came Gaia, the earth. She was the ground beneath every living thing. The mountains rose from her. The seas surrounded her. The valleys and forests belonged to her. And above Gaia was Uranus, the sky. Together, earth and sky became the parents of a new generation of divine beings. The Titans, they were not like the gods of later generations. They belonged to an older, more mysterious order. They represented immense forces of the ancient world, the passing of time, the shining heavens, memory, the sea, the great cycles of nature. Among these Titans was Cronus. He was not the oldest, but he would become the most important, and eventually, the most feared. Cronus watched his father, Uranus, rule over the universe. But Uranus was not a gentle ruler. He feared some of his own children, the Cyclopes and the enormous beings known as the Hecatoncheires. These beings were powerful. Too powerful, perhaps, for Uranus to feel comfortable with. So he forced them into the depths of the earth. Gaia suffered because of it. She was their mother, and she could feel her children trapped within her. The pain eventually became unbearable. So Gaia began looking for one of her children who would be brave enough to challenge Uranus. The Titans heard her call, but they were afraid. Uranus was powerful. He was the sky itself. To challenge him was to challenge the existing order of the universe. Yet one Titan was willing, Cronus. Gaia gave Cronus a weapon, a curved blade of immense power. And when the moment came, Cronus rose against his father. The old order was broken. Uranus fell, and Cronus took his place. For a time, it seemed that a new age had begun. The Titans ruled. The universe was theirs, and Cronus sat at the center of their power. But there was something Cronus did not understand. By overthrowing his father, he had also inherited his father's fear. The fear of losing power, the fear of being replaced, the fear that one day the children he created would rise against him. It was a fear that would shape everything that followed. Cronus became ruler of the Titans, and beside him stood Rhea. She was his sister and his wife. Together, they became the parents of a new generation of gods. At first, there seemed to be nothing to fear. Their children were young. The universe was under Cronus's control. The Titans were powerful. Their reign appeared secure. But Cronus remembered what had happened to Uranus. He remembered that his own father had once ruled everything. And yet, Cronus had taken his throne. So what prevented his own children from doing the same? Nothing. And somewhere in the future, a prophecy was waiting. It said that one of Cronus's children would eventually overthrow him. The exact details of the prophecy varied in ancient traditions, but the fear at its center remained the same. Cronus would one day be defeated by his own blood. For a ruler who had built his entire existence around power, this was unbearable. He could not accept the possibility. He could not simply trust his children. He could not allow fate to take his throne. And so Cronus began to think of a solution. If his children could one day overthrow him, then perhaps they could never be allowed to grow up. Rhea began having children, and each time, Cronus watched. The first was Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. One by one, the children of Cronus and Rhea were born, and one by one, Cronus swallowed them. He did not kill them. Instead, he kept them trapped within himself. It was a horrifying solution. A father consuming his own children because he feared what they might someday become. Rhea could do nothing. She watched her children disappear, and each time another child was born, she knew what Cronus intended to do. The palace of the Titans remained powerful. The world continued. The seasons passed. The stars moved across the heavens. The seas continued to rise and fall. But beneath the surface of this magnificent divine kingdom, fear was growing. Cronus believed he had defeated the prophecy. He believed that by swallowing his children, he had prevented the future from ever arriving. He believed he had found a way to defeat fate itself. But fate had not forgotten him, because Rhea was still carrying another child. And this child would be different. His name would be Zeus. When Rhea realized that Zeus was about to be born, she understood that she could not allow Cronus to swallow another child. She had already lost Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. She could not give Zeus to Cronus, so she sought help. She traveled to Crete. There, in a hidden place far from the eyes of Cronus, Zeus was born. Rhea held her newborn son. For the first time, Cronus's plan was about to fail. But she knew that simply hiding Zeus would not be enough. Cronus would search. He would demand to see the child. He would expect Rhea to bring him his son. So Rhea created a deception. She wrapped a stone in cloth. She made it resemble a newborn child, and she brought it before Cronus. He did not look closely. Fear had already made him certain of what he expected. He took the bundle and swallowed it. The stone disappeared into the darkness within him. Cronus believed he had won. He believed Zeus was gone. He believed the prophecy had been defeated. But somewhere far from the palace of the Titans, the real Zeus was alive, a hidden child, a child who would grow without his father's knowledge, a child protected from the ruler of the universe. Rhea left Zeus in Crete. There, according to the ancient traditions, he was cared for and protected. The stories tell of the nymph Amalthea, who nourished the young god, and of the Curetes, armed warriors who guarded him. Whenever the baby Zeus cried, the Curetes would clash their weapons together. Their shields and spears created such a tremendous sound that it drowned out the cries of the child. They did this because they feared Cronus might hear him. Imagine that hidden place. Far from the palace of the Titans, a young god growing in secret. Outside, the world belonged to Cronus. The Titan king believed his throne was safe. He believed his children were trapped within him. He believed the prophecy had been defeated. But every day, Zeus grew stronger. He grew from an infant into a child, from a child into a young god. And while Cronus ruled the heavens, Zeus was learning. He was waiting. He was becoming the very thing Cronus feared. The prophecy had not disappeared. It had only been delayed. Years passed, and eventually, Zeus was ready to leave his hiding place. He had reached the moment when secrecy could no longer continue. He could not remain hidden forever. His father still ruled the universe. His brothers and sisters remained trapped within Cronus, and the Titans still held power. If Zeus wanted to change the world, he would have to return to it. He would have to confront Cronus, and before he could fight the Titans, he would first have to free the gods who had been swallowed before him. That would be the beginning of the great struggle, the beginning of the war, the beginning of the age that would eventually belong to the Olympians. But Zeus was not yet ready to fight. First, he needed a plan, and the first step would be to find a way to make Cronus release his children. Because before Zeus could defeat the Titans, he would have to bring his own family back into the world. For years, Zeus remained hidden. Far from the palace of Cronus, far from the eyes of the Titans, the child who was supposed to have disappeared was growing into something far more powerful. He was no longer the helpless infant his father had feared. He was a young god, and somewhere inside him was the knowledge that his life had been built around a secret. His father believed him dead. His brothers and sisters remained imprisoned, and the ruler of the universe continued to sit upon his throne, believing that nothing could ever challenge him. But Zeus had reached the moment when hiding was no longer enough. The world outside his refuge was changing, and sooner or later, Cronus would have to face the son he had tried to destroy. Zeus left Crete. The young god entered the world that his father ruled. He traveled beyond the place where he had been hidden and began preparing for the confrontation that would eventually change the order of the cosmos. But Zeus understood something important. He could not simply walk into the palace of Cronus and challenge the Titan king. Cronus had an entire generation of powerful gods behind him. The Titans were ancient. They were experienced. They had ruled the universe for generations. Zeus needed allies. And before he could gather an army, he needed to accomplish something even more difficult. He needed to free his brothers and sisters. The gods who had been swallowed by Cronus were still alive within him. They had not grown older in the ordinary way. They remained trapped inside their father's body. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. They were waiting for a moment they could not even know would come. And Zeus intended to give them that moment. But first, he needed to get close to Cronus. He needed to understand his father's world. He needed to find a way to make the Titan King release what he had swallowed. Zeus did not choose to attack immediately. Instead, he approached the problem with the quality that would become one of his greatest strengths: strategy. This was not a battle that could be won through strength alone. Cronus was powerful. He had defeated Uranus. He had ruled the Titans. He had swallowed 5 divine children without hesitation. A direct confrontation could destroy Zeus before the war even began. So Zeus searched for another way, and eventually he found help. The ancient traditions tell of a potion, a substance that would force Cronus to release the children he had swallowed. Zeus obtained it. Then he waited for the right moment. The Titan King had no idea what was coming. Cronus believed that the child who might overthrow him was gone. He had spent years believing that he had defeated the prophecy. His throne was secure. His children were imprisoned within him. The Titans still ruled. There was no reason for him to suspect danger. But Zeus was approaching, quietly, patiently. And when the opportunity came, he acted. Cronus consumed the potion. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then the ancient power within him began to react. The children he had swallowed could no longer remain trapped. One after another, they were released. First came Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. The gods emerged into the world again. They had been imprisoned for so long that their return was almost like the beginning of a new age. For the first time, Zeus was no longer alone. His brothers and sisters stood beside him. The children of Cronus were together, and they now knew the truth. Their father had tried to destroy them because he feared the future, but the future had arrived anyway. Zeus looked upon his brothers and sisters, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia. They were not simply family. They were potential allies. Together, they represented a new generation of divine power. But Zeus knew that freeing them was only the beginning. The Titans still ruled. Cronus still possessed the throne. And the other Titans were not going to surrender their power simply because the children of Cronus had returned. A confrontation was coming. The old generation and the new generation were moving toward one another. The Titans had ruled for ages. The Olympian gods were still young, and the difference in experience was enormous. Zeus needed more than his siblings. He needed weapons. He needed warriors. He needed beings powerful enough to stand against the Titans. And there was one place he needed to look. Deep beneath the earth, there were prisoners. Ancient beings whom Uranus had once feared. The Cyclopes, and the Hecatoncheires. These beings had been imprisoned long before Zeus was born. The Cyclopes were powerful creatures associated with extraordinary craftsmanship. The Hecatoncheires were enormous beings with 100 hands and immense strength. They had been trapped because the older gods feared their power. Now Zeus understood that the very beings who had once been imprisoned by his ancestors could become the key to defeating the Titans. So Zeus descended toward the depths. He traveled into the dark places beneath the world, far below the lands where mortals lived, far below the palace of the gods. The ancient prisoners waited. The darkness there was different from the darkness of night. It was the darkness of imprisonment, the kind of darkness that exists when no sunlight has touched a place for generations. The Cyclopes had been forgotten. The Hecatoncheires had been forgotten, but Zeus had not forgotten them. He freed them, and with their freedom, the balance of power began to change. The Cyclopes looked upon the young god who had released them. They understood what he was preparing to do. A war was coming, and they would help him. In return for their freedom, they would create weapons for Zeus and his brothers, weapons unlike anything the Titans possessed. The Cyclopes forged the thunderbolt, a weapon of divine power, a weapon that would become inseparable from Zeus himself. They also created the trident for Poseidon and the helm of darkness for Hades. 3 brothers, 3 extraordinary weapons, 3 powers preparing to challenge the old order. Zeus now possessed something that Cronus had never expected: unity. His family had been restored. His allies were gathering, and weapons capable of challenging the Titans were being created. The war was no longer an impossible dream. It was becoming inevitable. The Titans began to realize that something was changing. The children of Cronus were no longer scattered. They were no longer helpless. They were gathering, and Zeus was becoming a leader. Cronus had once believed that the prophecy could be defeated by swallowing his children. Now those same children were standing together, and they were preparing to take everything from him. The ancient world was beginning to divide. On one side stood Cronus and the Titans, the old rulers, the powers of the previous generation. On the other stood Zeus and the younger gods, a new generation, a generation that believed the universe could belong to them. Neither side could simply step away. Neither side was willing to surrender. And so, the first movements of war began. The gods gathered their forces. The Titans prepared their defenses. The heavens seemed to hold their breath. The earth stood between them, and somewhere above the clouds, Zeus held the weapon that would become the symbol of his reign, the thunderbolt. He had spent his childhood hiding from Cronus. Now he was preparing to face him. The son had returned. The father was still king, and between them stood an entire generation of gods. The question was no longer whether there would be a war. The question was, who would survive it? For the first time since Cronus had overthrown Uranus, the old order of the universe was truly threatened. The Titans had ruled for generations, but their reign had never faced an enemy like this. Zeus had something Cronus had not expected. He had his family. He had powerful allies. He had extraordinary weapons. And most importantly, he had nothing left to fear from his father. The hiding was over. The waiting was over. The time for confrontation had arrived. Across the ancient world, the armies of the gods began to gather. The Titans stood on one side. The children of Cronus stood on the other. And when the first armies finally met, the earth itself would tremble. The war that would decide the fate of the universe was about to begin. The time for hiding had finally come to an end. Zeus had spent the first part of his life far from the palace of his father. He had grown in secret while Cronus ruled the universe. But now, the secret could no longer remain hidden. The children of Cronus had been freed. The Cyclopes had been released from their ancient prison. The Hecatoncheires had been brought back into the world, and the young gods were beginning to gather around Zeus. Yet there was still one enormous problem. The Titans were powerful. They had ruled the universe for generations. They were not going to surrender their kingdom simply because a younger generation had returned. Cronus still had followers. His brothers and sisters still possessed enormous strength, and many of the ancient powers of the world remained loyal to the old order. The coming conflict would not be a small rebellion. It would be a war between generations, the old gods against the new, the Titans against the children of Cronus. And at the center of the younger generation stood Zeus. He understood that he needed more than courage. He needed allies. He needed a place from which to organize his forces. And most importantly, he needed time. The younger gods gathered together. Zeus spoke with his brothers. Poseidon possessed the power of the sea. Hades carried the mysterious authority of the underworld. Their sisters stood beside them as well: Hera, Demeter, Hestia. Together, they formed the beginning of something new. They were not yet the Olympians, as later generations would imagine them. There was no peaceful Mount Olympus overlooking a settled divine kingdom. There was only uncertainty. The old order still stood, and the new order had not yet been born. Zeus knew that the first battle would determine everything. If they lost, Cronus would remain king. The Titans would continue to rule, and the children of Cronus might once again be imprisoned or destroyed. There would be no second chance. So Zeus began preparing. He had the thunderbolt, created by the Cyclopes. Poseidon had his trident. Hades possessed the helm that could conceal him from sight. These weapons were more than tools of war. They represented the arrival of a new kind of divine power. The Cyclopes had given the younger gods something the Titans had never expected: weapons capable of challenging the old rulers. But Zeus needed more than weapons. He needed warriors. And this was where the Hecatoncheires became important. They were ancient beings of immense strength. Each possessed 100 hands. Their power was almost impossible to imagine. They had been imprisoned because the older gods feared what they might become. Now Zeus had freed them, and they had a reason to fight. They had no love for the Titans. They had spent ages trapped beneath the earth. Their freedom had been given to them by Zeus. So when the time came, they would stand beside him. The younger gods were gathering. The old gods were gathering too. Across the ancient world, preparations began. The Titans established their position. Cronus knew that the threat was real now. The child he had attempted to destroy had returned. The children he had swallowed had been freed, and the weapons of the Cyclopes were now in the hands of his enemies. The prophecy had become reality. There was no longer any way to escape it. Cronus had spent years trying to prevent this moment, but every attempt had only delayed it. Now Zeus stood before him, not as a helpless child, not as a hidden infant, but as a rival, a god powerful enough to challenge the king of the Titans. The two sides prepared for war. The Titans gathered their forces. Among them stood powerful beings of the ancient generation. They were enormous, ancient, experienced. They had ruled before Zeus had even been born. Some of the Titans remained loyal to Cronus. Others would eventually choose a different path. One of the most important was Oceanus. Unlike many of the Titans, Oceanus did not join the conflict against Zeus. His choice would become significant. Another Titan, Prometheus, also recognized that the younger gods might represent the future. Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus would eventually side with Zeus, but for now, the lines were being drawn. Not every Titan stood together. Not every god was certain. The universe itself seemed divided. The younger gods looked toward Zeus. The older gods looked toward Cronus, and between them stood the future of creation. There was no battlefield yet, but everyone knew one was coming. The first great confrontation would take place around Mount Olympus. This was the stronghold of the Titans. For generations, their power had radiated from there. It was the seat of the old order, and if Zeus wanted to replace Cronus, he would eventually have to challenge that power directly. Across the world, the younger gods moved into position. Zeus watched the preparations. He knew what was at stake. He had not spent his entire life hiding simply to become another ruler. He wanted freedom for his family. He wanted to end Cronus's tyranny. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside him, he believed that the universe needed a new order, an order where the children would not have to fear their parents. an order where the gods could exist without being swallowed by those who came before them. But changing the universe would not be easy. The Titans would not surrender. They had power. They had experience. And they had the advantage of being deeply established. Zeus and his allies were the newcomers. They were the younger generation. They had to prove that they were strong enough to replace the gods who came before them. The first clash came. The earth shook. The sky seemed to tremble. The Titans and the younger gods attacked one another. The sound of divine weapons filled the ancient world. The thunderbolt flashed. The sea answered Poseidon's power. The darkness surrounding Hades became a weapon, and the Titans fought back with everything they possessed. For the first time, Zeus understood the true scale of the war. This was not like fighting a mortal army. There was no single battlefield that could decide everything. The Titans themselves were forces of immense power. The earth could shake beneath their footsteps. The mountains could tremble. The heavens could become dark. The younger gods were powerful, but the Titans were ancient. The war would not be won quickly. It would continue, and continue, and continue. Years would pass. 10 years according to the ancient tradition. 10 years of conflict between the old generation and the new. The younger gods fought from their stronghold. The Titans fought from theirs. Neither side could easily defeat the other, and so the war became a struggle of endurance. Every victory was temporary. Every defeat could be recovered from. The gods fought again and again. The world itself became a battlefield. Imagine the ancient earth during those years. The mountains standing beneath a sky filled with divine conflict. The seas disturbed by Poseidon's power. The earth shaking beneath the force of the Titans. And above everything, the thunderbolt of Zeus becoming brighter with every passing battle. Yet Zeus still needed something, an advantage, something that could finally break the balance. Because strength alone was not enough. The Titans were too powerful. The war had become a stalemate. And then Zeus remembered the beings he had freed from the depths. The Cyclopes had already given him his weapon. But the Hecatoncheires possessed something even more valuable: raw strength. They could hurl enormous stones. They could fight with 100 hands. They could overwhelm armies through sheer force. And Zeus realized that their power might finally give his side the advantage it needed. The Hecatoncheires joined the younger gods. The balance began to shift. But even then, the Titans did not fall. They continued fighting. The old generation refused to surrender. Cronus refused to abandon his throne. He had fought too hard to gain it. He had overthrown Uranus. He had ruled for generations. And now his son had returned to take everything from him. The conflict had become personal. Father against son. Past against future. Fear against destiny. Cronus had tried to prevent the prophecy. But every action he had taken had brought him closer to fulfilling it. Now the prophecy stood before him. Zeus, his own son. The child he believed he had swallowed. The child he believed could never threaten him. Now carrying the thunderbolt. Now surrounded by allies. Now leading an army. The war entered its most violent stage. The younger gods pushed against the Titans. The Hecatoncheires hurled enormous rocks. The Cyclopes continued supporting Zeus. Poseidon attacked with the force of the sea. Hades moved unseen beneath the protection of his magical helm. And Zeus unleashed the thunderbolt. Lightning crossed the sky. The ancient world shook. The Titans fought back. The battle continued. And still, the final victory had not come. The war had lasted for years. Both sides were exhausted. But neither was willing to surrender. Then Zeus realized that victory would require more than individual battles. He needed to break the strength of the Titans completely. The war would have to become a battle for the foundations of the old order itself. And so the younger gods prepared for their greatest assault. The thunderbolt was ready. The trident was ready. The helm of darkness was ready. The Hecatoncheires were ready. The gods stood together. For the first time, Zeus had everything he needed: an army, weapons, allies, and a reason to fight. Across the battlefield, the Titans waited. The ancient rulers looked toward the younger gods. They had ruled the universe before Zeus existed. They believed that their age could continue, but the world was changing. A new generation had arrived, and the final struggle was approaching. The sky darkened, the earth trembled, the sea rose, and Zeus lifted the thunderbolt. The war that had begun as a rebellion was about to become the greatest battle the gods had ever known. The moment had finally arrived. For years, Zeus had prepared. For years, the Titans had held their ground. And now there was no longer any distance between the two generations. The war for the universe had begun. The ancient Greeks would later remember this conflict as the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the younger gods. It was not a war fought for a single city. It was not a war fought over a piece of land. It was a struggle for something much greater, the right to rule the cosmos itself. On one side stood Cronus and the Titans. They represented the old order, the generation that had defeated Uranus, the generation that had ruled the universe before Zeus was even born. On the other side stood Zeus and his brothers and sisters, the younger gods, the generation that wanted to replace the old rulers. Between them was an enormous divide. The Titans had age, they had experience, they had ruled for generations. But Zeus possessed something different. He had unity. His brothers and sisters stood beside him. The Cyclopes had given him weapons unlike anything the Titans had seen, and the Hecatoncheires had brought immense strength to his side. Still, the Titans were not weak. The first clashes were violent. The earth shook beneath the force of the gods. The sky darkened. Mountains trembled. The sound of divine weapons echoed across the world. Zeus raised the thunderbolt. Lightning exploded across the heavens. The Titans answered with their own power. The conflict spread. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The younger gods attacked. The Titans pushed them back. Then the younger gods returned. Again and again. The war became a struggle of endurance. There were no easy victories, no single moment when one side simply defeated the other. Instead, the battle continued year after year. The gods fought across the ancient world. The Titans defended their stronghold. Zeus and his allies fought from their own position. Every day brought another confrontation. Every night brought exhaustion. But the next morning, the fighting began again. The war had become part of the world itself. The earth had never experienced anything like it. The mountains that seemed eternal were shaken by divine power. The seas responded to the conflict. The sky was repeatedly illuminated by Zeus's lightning. And beneath it all, the mortal world remained almost completely unaware of the true scale of what was happening above and around it. This was a conflict between beings older than human civilization. The mortals who would one day tell these stories could barely imagine its scale. For Zeus, however, there was no mythology yet. There was only survival. Every battle brought him closer to death. Every victory carried a price. And every defeat reminded him that Cronus was still powerful. The thunderbolt was extraordinary, but even the thunderbolt could not instantly defeat the Titans. Zeus learned that quickly. His enemies were not ordinary warriors. They were ancient, divine beings. They had powers of their own. They knew how to fight, and they were fighting for everything they had. Cronus, in particular, refused to surrender. He had spent his entire existence rising toward power. First, he had challenged Uranus. Then he had become king. He had ruled over the Titans. He had believed his throne was secure. Now his own son stood against him. Cronus could not accept the idea that the child he had feared would actually replace him. So he fought. The Titan king gathered his strength. The old gods stood beside him. The conflict intensified. Zeus began to understand that this would not be a quick victory. If he wanted to win, he would have to endure. The younger gods fought for their future. The Titans fought for their past. And neither side could simply walk away. As the years passed, the world around them seemed increasingly transformed by the conflict. The gods hurled enormous weapons. The earth shook. The mountains cracked. The sea became violent. Lightning filled the heavens. It was as though nature itself had become part of the battle. And still, the Titans survived. The war continued for years. 10 years, the ancient stories tell us. 10 years of struggle. 10 years in which the fate of the universe remained uncertain. Imagine what that means. A single battle can be terrifying, but this was not one battle. It was an age of battle. A generation of gods grew up knowing that war was taking place. The younger gods could not simply wait for peace. They had to fight for it. Zeus himself changed during those years. He had begun as a hidden child. Then he had become a young god seeking to free his family. Now he was becoming a commander, a leader, a figure capable of bringing other divine beings together. The thunderbolt in his hand became more than a weapon. It became a symbol, a sign that the old order was being challenged. But Zeus also understood that leadership came with responsibility. His decisions affected everyone around him. If he made a mistake, his allies could die. If he lost control, the Titans could regain the advantage. He had to think beyond his own strength. He had to think about the entire war. And slowly, he began to recognize the importance of his allies. The Cyclopes were not simply craftsmen. Their knowledge and power were essential. The Hecatoncheires were not simply enormous warriors. Their ability to fight with 100 hands gave Zeus something the Titans could not easily match. And his brothers were not merely family. Poseidon and Hades were becoming powerful forces in their own right. Poseidon could command the sea. Hades possessed a weapon that allowed him to disappear from sight. Together, the three brothers formed the core of the new generation. Zeus understood that the Titans could not be defeated by one god alone. It would take all of them. The war continued. Then came another crucial development. The younger gods began to understand that not every Titan supported Cronus. Some Titans had reasons of their own to oppose the king. Prometheus, the Titan who possessed extraordinary foresight, recognized that Zeus's generation might eventually become the rulers of the cosmos. He sided with Zeus. His brother Epimetheus also joined the younger gods. Their decision weakened Cronus's position. Not every ancient power was willing to fight for the old king, and that mattered, because a war is not only decided by strength, it is also decided by loyalty. Cronus had ruled through fear. But Zeus was beginning to build alliances through trust. The difference would become important. Still, the Titans remained formidable. They continued to resist. Their armies met the forces of Zeus again and again. The battlefield became a place of enormous destruction. The younger gods would advance. The Titans would push them back. Zeus would unleash lightning. The Titans would survive. The cycle continued. And as the 10th year approached, The younger gods knew that something had to change. They could not continue fighting the same battle forever. They needed a final advantage, something powerful enough to break the strength of the Titans, something that could transform the war from a struggle into a victory. Zeus looked toward the ancient beings who had been imprisoned beneath the earth, the Hecatoncheires. They had already joined him, but now their full power would be needed. The 100-handed giants were capable of throwing enormous stones, one after another, again and again. A storm of rocks could descend upon the Titans. At the same time, Zeus could unleash his thunderbolt. Poseidon could strike with his trident. Hades could move unseen. The younger gods finally possessed a strategy, not simply to fight the Titans, but to overwhelm them. The final confrontation was approaching. The Titans sensed it too. They knew that the younger gods were becoming stronger. They knew that the war could no longer continue forever. Cronus looked toward the forces of Zeus. The child he had tried to destroy was now standing before him. The prophecy had come true. The throne he had stolen from Uranus was now being threatened by his own son. The cycle was repeating. Father had defeated father. Son was now challenging father. And the universe waited to see whether history would repeat itself once again. The battlefield became silent for a brief moment. Not because the war was over, but because something greater was about to begin. The younger gods gathered. The Hecatoncheires prepared. The Cyclopes stood ready. Poseidon raised his trident. Hades prepared to disappear into darkness, and Zeus held the thunderbolt, the weapon of the new age. Above them, the sky darkened. The clouds gathered. Lightning flashed across the heavens. The earth trembled beneath the approaching conflict. Then Zeus lifted his hand. The final assault was beginning. The Titans had fought for 10 years. They had resisted every attack. They had defended their ancient kingdom. But now they were facing something different. Not one god, not one weapon, but an alliance. A new generation, united behind a single purpose. The old order had reached its final moment. The battle that would decide the fate of the universe was about to reach its climax. And when it did, the world would never be the same again. The final battle was approaching. For 10 long years, the Titans and the younger gods had fought across the ancient world. Neither side had been willing to surrender. But now something had changed. Zeus and his allies were no longer simply trying to survive. They were preparing to win. The weapons of the Cyclopes were ready. Poseidon held his mighty trident. Hades possessed the helm that could hide him from the sight of his enemies. And Zeus carried the thunderbolt. But perhaps the greatest change of all was the presence of the Hecatoncheires. The ancient 100-handed beings had finally been released from their prison, and now they stood beside Zeus. Their strength was enormous. Each possessed 100 hands, and with those hands they could hurl enormous stones toward the enemy. The Titans had never faced such an army. For years, they had fought the younger gods and held them back. But now the balance was beginning to shift. Zeus looked toward the stronghold of the Titans. There stood the ancient rulers, the generation that had controlled the universe before him. Cronus was still there, still powerful, still unwilling to surrender. The son had returned to challenge the father, and now the final confrontation was beginning. The first attack came with tremendous force. The Hecatoncheires began throwing enormous stones, one after another, then another, then another. The sky seemed filled with flying mountains. The earth shook as the stones crashed down. The Titans struggled to maintain their position. The younger gods advanced. Poseidon struck with the power of the sea. The waters responded to his command. Waves rose. The ground beneath the Titans became unstable. The ancient world seemed to move beneath the force of the battle. Then Hades entered the conflict. He wore the magical helm given to him by the Cyclopes, and suddenly he could disappear from sight. The Titans could not easily see where he was. He could move through the battlefield unseen. He could approach without warning. He could strike and vanish again. The three brothers were fighting together, Zeus in the heavens, Poseidon with the sea, Hades within the darkness. For the first time, their combined strength began to overwhelm the Titans. And then, Zeus raised the thunderbolt. The sky changed. Clouds gathered above him. Lightning appeared in the darkness. The thunderbolt was not like an ordinary weapon. It represented the raw power of the heavens. When Zeus unleashed it, the sky erupted. Lightning struck across the battlefield. The earth trembled. The mountains shook. The Titans were forced backward. Again Zeus struck, and again. The thunderbolts came like flashes of divine fire. The Titans attempted to resist. They had fought for thousands of years. They had ruled before Zeus. They were not going to disappear quietly. They attacked with everything they had. The battlefield became almost impossible to comprehend. The old gods and the new gods collided. The Hecatoncheires continued throwing their enormous stones. The Cyclopes supported Zeus and his allies. Poseidon brought the sea into the conflict. Hades moved unseen. And Zeus continued to unleash the power of the thunderbolt. The heavens burned with light. The earth shook beneath the conflict. The sea rose and crashed against the shores. It was as though the entire cosmos had become a battlefield. The Titans began losing ground. Their ancient strength was no longer enough. For years, they had relied on their experience and their power. But the younger gods had something different. They worked together. They possessed weapons created specifically for the war, and they had the support of beings who had once been imprisoned by the old order. The balance had finally shifted. Still, Cronus remained. The Titan king watched his forces fall back. He understood what was happening. His reign was ending. The prophecy had become reality. The child he had feared had grown into the god who could defeat him. But Cronus did not simply surrender. He resisted. The ancient Titan gathered his strength. For a moment, the younger gods faced the ruler of the old universe. Cronus had once been unstoppable. He had defeated Uranus. He had swallowed his children. He had ruled the cosmos. But now he stood against Zeus, father and son, old king and future king. The two generations faced one another. Zeus raised the thunderbolt. Cronus stood against him. And for a moment, everything seemed to become still. Then the battle erupted again. Lightning filled the sky. The earth shook. The sea roared. The Hecatoncheires hurled their stones. The Titans fought back. But Zeus and his allies were stronger now. The war had reached its final stage. One by one, the Titans were overwhelmed. Some fled. Some surrendered. Some were captured. And some would later be punished for their resistance. The ancient order was collapsing. The Titans, who had once seemed eternal, were being defeated by the generation they had underestimated. And at the center of it all stood Zeus, the hidden child of Rhea, the son Cronus had tried to swallow, the god who had grown far from his father's throne. He had returned, and now he was standing on the edge of victory. But victory had a price. The world had been devastated by the war. Mountains had been shaken. The heavens had been disturbed. The earth had endured forces beyond anything mortals could imagine. The conflict had lasted for 10 years. 10 years of divine struggle. 10 years of uncertainty. And now, the Titans were finally falling. The Hecatoncheires surrounded the defeated ancient powers. Their 100 hands were more than enough to restrain them. The younger gods had won. But there was still one question. What would happen to the Titans? Zeus now had the power to decide. He could simply destroy them, or he could imprison them. The ancient stories tell that the defeated Titans were eventually confined in Tartarus, a deep region of the underworld, far beneath the earth. There, the old rulers would remain separated from the world they had once controlled. The Titans who had ruled the universe were no longer its rulers. The age of Cronus was over, and the age of Zeus had begun. But Zeus understood something important. Winning a war was not the same as creating peace. He had defeated his enemies. But the universe still needed to be organized. The younger gods had won the right to rule. But who would rule what? Who would control the heavens? Who would rule the sea? Who would govern the realm of the dead? The three brothers now stood before an enormous question. They had fought together. They had defeated the Titans together. But the cosmos was too vast for them to simply share everything. A division would have to be made, and the answer would come through an ancient tradition. The three brothers would cast lots. Zeus would receive the heavens, Poseidon would receive the sea, and Hades would receive the underworld. The earth and Mount Olympus would become the center of the new divine order. For the first time, the universe had new rulers. But before Zeus could truly become king, there was still work to do. The Titans had been defeated, yet the world was not completely peaceful. Other ancient forces remained. The giants would eventually challenge the Olympians. Typhon would one day rise against Zeus, and even among the gods themselves, conflict would continue. But those battles belonged to another chapter. For now, the greatest enemy had fallen. Cronus was defeated. The Titans were imprisoned, and Zeus stood victorious. He had begun his life as a hidden child. He had grown in secret. He had returned to confront his father. He had freed his brothers and sisters. He had gathered allies. He had fought a war that lasted 10 years. And now, he had won. The thunderbolt remained in his hand. Above him stretched the heavens. Below him lay the ancient earth. And beyond the horizon was a world waiting for a new ruler. Zeus looked upon that world. The war was over, but his reign was only beginning. The great battle had finally come to an end. For 10 years, the ancient world had been caught between two generations of gods. The Titans had fought to preserve the order they had inherited. Zeus and his allies had fought to create something new. And now, the old order had fallen. The battlefield that had once echoed with thunder and the voices of divine warriors had begun to grow quiet. The mountains no longer shook beneath the same fury. The skies slowly cleared. The sea began to settle. For the first time in many years, there was something the gods had almost forgotten: silence. Zeus stood among his victorious allies. He had won, but victory did not immediately feel like peace. There was still the question of what should happen to the defeated Titans. These were not ordinary enemies. They were the ancient rulers of the cosmos. They were members of Zeus's own family. Some had fought directly against him. Others had remained neutral. Some had even supported him. The Titans could not simply be treated as one single group. Their stories would now separate. Some would receive punishment. Some would remain free. And some would become part of the new order. But the greatest question concerned Cronus, the former king, the father of Zeus, the ruler who had once believed that nothing could take his throne. Cronus had lost everything. His children had escaped him. His enemies had defeated his army. His throne was gone. And the prophecy he had spent his life trying to prevent had finally become reality. His own son had overthrown him. In that sense, the cycle had come full circle. Cronus had once overthrown Uranus. Now Zeus had overthrown Cronus. One generation had replaced another, and the universe had entered a new age. But Zeus knew that simply defeating Cronus was not enough. The old rulers had to be prevented from rising again. The victorious gods therefore turned their attention toward the deepest regions of the cosmos. Tartarus, a place so deep beneath the earth that even the ordinary underworld seemed distant from it. The ancient Greeks imagined Tartarus as a vast and terrible region. It was not simply a prison. It was a place of profound darkness, a place beneath the foundations of the world, and it was there that the defeated Titans would eventually be confined. The Hecatoncheires became their guards. The same ancient beings who had once been imprisoned by the old order now helped protect the new one. There was something almost symbolic about this. Those who had once been chained were now the ones holding the chains. The Titans were taken away. Their reign was over. The halls of power that had once belonged to them were now empty. The ancient world had changed, but not every Titan was punished in the same way. Some had chosen not to fight Zeus. Oceanus, for example, remained apart from the main conflict. Prometheus had supported Zeus. His foresight had helped him understand where the future was moving. And because of those choices, the new divine order was not simply a destruction of everything that had come before. Some parts of the old generation would survive. Some ancient powers would remain. The universe was changing, not being erased. And Zeus understood that. He had not fought merely to destroy. He had fought to rule. That meant he now had to create an order capable of lasting. The first task was to determine how the cosmos itself would be divided. Zeus had his brothers beside him. Poseidon, Hades, the three sons of Cronus had survived. They had fought together. They had defeated the Titans. But now a new question appeared. Who would rule what? The universe was too vast for a single god to control every realm. There were the heavens, the seas, the underworld, the earth. Each required its own authority. So the brothers made a decision. They would divide the realms by casting lots. It was not simply a political arrangement. It was the beginning of the structure that would define Greek mythology for generations. The lots were cast, and Zeus received the heavens, the realm above, the sky, the domain of storms, clouds, lightning, and the great expanse above the earth. Poseidon received the sea, the endless waters surrounding the world, the realm of waves, storms, earthquakes, and all the mysteries beneath the surface. And Hades received the underworld, the dark kingdom of the dead, a realm that was not necessarily evil, but separate, silent, unavoidable. The earth itself remained a shared realm, and Mount Olympus would eventually become the center of the new generation of gods. The three brothers had divided the cosmos. The age of the Titans had ended. The age of the Olympians had begun. For Zeus, this was the fulfillment of everything that had happened since his birth. He had been hidden because Cronus feared him. He had grown in secret. He had returned. He had freed his brothers and sisters. He had gathered allies. He had fought the Titans. And now, he possessed the heavens. But becoming ruler brought a responsibility that Zeus had not yet experienced. Power was no longer something he was fighting to obtain. Power was now something he had to maintain. That difference would shape the rest of his story. As king, Zeus would have to deal with gods who disagreed with him. He would have to settle disputes. He would have to maintain order. He would have to defend his position. And eventually, he would face new enemies. The Titans had been defeated, but the universe was far from peaceful. The giants still existed. Ancient monsters still lurked beyond the known world. And one day, an enormous creature named Typhon would rise against Zeus himself. But none of that had happened yet, for now Zeus had time. The first great threat to his rule had been defeated. He could finally look upon the heavens without seeing his father's shadow. Cronus had once ruled the sky. Now Zeus did. The thunderbolt became the symbol of his authority. Whenever lightning flashed across the heavens, the ancient Greeks would remember the power of their chief god. The weapon forged by the Cyclopes had become more than a weapon. It had become an emblem of kingship, and Zeus was now king. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of the story was not that Zeus had won, it was how completely the world had changed. Before Zeus, the Titans ruled. After Zeus, the Olympians would become the dominant gods of Greek mythology. The stories people would tell for centuries would revolve around this new divine family: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hades, Demeter, Hestia, and eventually the children and descendants who would become famous throughout the ancient world: Apollo, Artemis, Athena, Hermes, Ares, Dionysus, and many others. Their stories would fill the mythology of Greece, but none of them could have risen to prominence without the war that came before them. The Titanomachy was the turning point. It was the moment when one divine generation gave way to another. The old world became the foundation for the new, and at the center of that transition stood Zeus. The child who had once been hidden was now the ruler of the heavens. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Cronus had failed to escape his fate, and Zeus had become exactly what his father feared: a king. But there was an important difference between Zeus and Cronus. Zeus did not want to spend his entire reign looking over his shoulder, terrified that his own children would replace him. At least, that was the hope. He wanted to establish an order that would last. He wanted the gods to have their own domains. He wanted the cosmos divided and organized. The universe needed stability, and Zeus intended to provide it. The victorious gods began settling into their new roles. Poseidon returned to the sea. Hades descended into his dark kingdom. The other gods found their places, and Zeus remained above them. The sky belonged to him, thunder belonged to him, lightning belonged to him, and the throne of the gods belonged to him. But a king is only truly a king when his authority is recognized. And Zeus's authority was about to be tested. The Titans had been defeated, but the world still contained powers older than the Olympians, powers that had not accepted the new order, powers that would eventually rise against Zeus. The first great war was over. The next struggle had not yet begun. For a moment, the universe was quiet. The gods could breathe. The earth could settle. The heavens could clear. And Zeus could finally look upon the world he had fought so hard to inherit. He had won the war, but now came the harder task. He had to rule, and ruling the cosmos would prove to be almost as difficult as conquering it. The war was over. For the first time in an age, the heavens were quiet. The Titans had fallen. Cronus no longer ruled, and Zeus stood at the beginning of a reign that would shape the mythology of Greece for generations to come. But defeating an enemy is one thing. Ruling what remains is something entirely different. Zeus had spent years fighting for the right to lead. Now he had to prove that he could actually govern. The younger gods gathered around him. They had survived the Great War. They had watched the old order collapse, and now they needed to decide what the new order would look like. Zeus could not simply command every part of existence himself. The cosmos was too enormous. The heavens stretched endlessly above the earth. The seas surrounded the world, and beneath the earth lay the mysterious kingdom of the dead. Each realm required its own ruler. So Zeus turned to the two brothers who had fought beside him, Poseidon and Hades. Together, the three sons of Cronus had survived their father's tyranny. Together, they had challenged the Titans. And together, they would now divide the universe. According to the ancient tradition, they cast lots to determine their realms. Zeus received the heavens. Poseidon received the sea. Hades received the underworld. The arrangement was not a division of their family. They were still brothers, but each now possessed a kingdom of his own. Zeus became the ruler of the sky. He commanded thunder and lightning. The storms belonged to his authority. The great expanse above the earth became his domain. Poseidon descended toward the sea. His trident became the symbol of his power. He ruled the waters and the forces that moved beneath them. And Hades entered the realm of the dead. His kingdom was dark and distant, but it was not simply a place of punishment. It was the realm where the dead would eventually go. Each brother now possessed enormous power, but Zeus held something more. He was recognized as the leader of the new generation, the king, the one who had led the rebellion, the one who had brought the younger gods together, the one who had carried the thunderbolt into battle. The throne belonged to him. But Zeus's position was not automatically secure. The other gods were powerful. Some were his siblings, others would become his children, and some had their own ambitions. A king could not rule simply by demanding obedience. He had to maintain balance. He had to settle disputes. He had to keep the gods from turning against one another. And Zeus would soon discover that ruling a family of immortals could be far more complicated than defeating an army of titans. The new gods began establishing their homes. Mount Olympus became associated with the Olympian gods. High above the mortal world, it became a place of divine gatherings. The gods could meet there. They could feast. They could argue. They could make decisions. And from that mountain, Zeus would eventually oversee the affairs of gods and mortals. The world was beginning to take the form that later generations would recognize. But the transition was not immediate. The old powers had not simply disappeared. The Titans remained in Tartarus. Ancient forces still existed. The earth was still filled with mysteries. The seas were still dangerous, and the mortal world was only beginning to take shape beneath the new divine order. Zeus understood that he needed to establish authority. He could not allow another generation to rise and immediately challenge him. He had seen what happened to Cronus. He knew that power without stability could eventually destroy itself. So Zeus began creating an order based upon laws, oaths, and divine authority. He became associated with justice, with hospitality, with the protection of guests and strangers, with the sacred promises that held society together. The king of the gods was not simply a god of storms. His power extended into the structure of the world itself. When mortals made oaths, Zeus could be called upon as their witness. When guests entered another person's home, the sacred rules of hospitality came under his protection. When rulers sought legitimacy, they looked toward the authority of Zeus. His reign therefore became larger than the battlefield. The thunderbolt had won the war, but law would maintain the peace, and Zeus would need both. Still, the new order was not peaceful for long. The defeat of the Titans had created a new balance, but some ancient beings did not accept it. The universe had changed too quickly. The old powers had been pushed aside. The younger gods had taken control, and resentment was beginning to grow. Among the ancient forces were the giants. They were not the same as the Titans. They belonged to another ancient generation. but they were powerful. And eventually, they would rise against the Olympians. The conflict would become known as the Gigantomachy. Yet before that happened, Zeus had to establish his kingdom. He had to build relationships with the other gods. And he had to ensure that Olympus became more than a place where gods lived. It had to become the center of the new cosmic order. One by one, the divine family found its place. Hera became one of the most important goddesses of Olympus. She was associated with marriage and queenship. Demeter became associated with the earth, agriculture, and the harvest. Hestia became the goddess of the hearth. Poseidon ruled the sea. Hades ruled the dead. And Zeus stood above the divine order. The family that had once been swallowed by Cronus was now ruling the universe. There was something almost poetic about it. Cronus had tried to prevent his children from ever reaching adulthood. He had feared them. He had swallowed them. He had tried to stop the prophecy. Yet those same children now stood at the center of the new world. His fear had created the very future he had wanted to prevent. Zeus understood the lesson. Fate could not simply be destroyed by fear. The more Cronus tried to escape it, the closer he came to fulfilling it. And now Zeus had inherited his father's throne. But he did not want to repeat everything his father had done. He wanted to create something lasting, a kingdom that could survive, a divine order that could govern gods and mortals alike. And for a time, it seemed possible. The heavens were calm, the sea had its ruler, the underworld had its king, the gods had a home, and Zeus had his throne. From that throne, he could look across the world, the mountains, the forests, the rivers, the seas, and the growing population of mortals below. Human beings were still fragile. They depended upon the earth. They feared storms. They feared darkness. They did not understand the forces that controlled their lives. And Zeus would eventually become deeply involved in their world. He would give them blessings. He would punish them. He would protect some. He would destroy others. His relationship with humanity would become one of the largest parts of his mythology. But before that story could unfold, Zeus had to secure his own kingdom. The Titans had been defeated, yet Zeus knew that victory could never be taken for granted. The same cycle that had brought him to power could happen again. One generation could overthrow another. One ruler could replace the next. The universe could fall into chaos. So Zeus began surrounding himself with allies. The Cyclopes remained important. Their craftsmanship had given him the thunderbolt. The Hecatoncheires continued to guard the prisoners of Tartarus. And the gods who had fought beside him became the foundation of his kingdom. The new order was taking shape, but one thing still remained uncertain. Would the universe accept Zeus as its permanent ruler? The answer would soon be tested. The giants would rise, and later, an even more terrifying creature would emerge, Typhon, a being so powerful that even Zeus would have to fight for his throne once again. But those battles belonged to the future. For now, Zeus could enjoy the first true moment of peace he had known since childhood. He had escaped his father's attempt to destroy him. He had freed his family. He had defeated the Titans. He had divided the cosmos with his brothers. And now he stood as king. The thunderbolt rested in his hand. The clouds gathered around the heavens. The gods looked toward him. And below, the mortal world continued to grow. A new age had begun. The age of Olympus. The age of Zeus. The old rulers were gone. The new rulers had arrived. But the story of Zeus was far from finished. In fact, his greatest challenges were only beginning. Because becoming king was one thing. Remaining king would be another matter entirely. The Great War was finally over. The Titans had fallen. Cronus had lost his throne, and Zeus had taken his place among the highest powers of the universe. But the end of the war was not simply the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a completely different world. For generations, the Titans had ruled the cosmos. Their names belonged to an age before the Olympian gods, before Zeus, before Hera, before Poseidon and Hades, before the divine family that would eventually become the center of Greek mythology. Now that age had ended. A new one had begun, the age of Zeus. But Zeus's victory had changed more than the identity of the ruler. It had changed the structure of the universe itself. The three brothers had divided the great realms. Zeus took the heavens. Poseidon received the sea. Hades received the underworld. And the earth remained the place where gods and mortals would meet. It was an arrangement that would shape countless stories. Whenever thunder rolled across the sky, Zeus's presence could be imagined. Whenever the sea rose into enormous waves, Poseidon's power could be felt. And whenever a mortal died and passed beyond the world of the living, the realm of Hades awaited. The universe now had order, but that order had been purchased through war. The Titans had not simply stepped aside. They had been defeated, imprisoned, and removed from the center of divine power. Their age had become the past. Zeus's age had become the present. And eventually, it would become the foundation of Greek mythology. Yet Zeus himself could not simply sit upon his throne and assume that his kingdom would last forever. He knew better. He had learned from Cronus. He had seen what happened when a ruler believed his position could never be challenged. So Zeus began his reign with something his father had never truly possessed: a world organized around a new generation of gods. A world organized. He had sisters. He had allies. He had the Cyclopes. He had the Hecatoncheires. And he had the thunderbolt. But perhaps most importantly, he had the experience of surviving the struggle for power. Zeus had learned that strength alone was not enough. His father had possessed strength. The Titans had possessed strength. But strength without unity could eventually fail. Zeus had won because he had brought different powers together. The Cyclopes had given him weapons. The Hecatoncheires had given him overwhelming force. His brothers had fought beside him. Some Titans had even recognized that the old order could not survive. Zeus had understood how to create an alliance. That ability would become one of the foundations of his reign. But peace did not mean that Zeus could stop fighting forever. The universe was still filled with ancient powers. The Titans were not the only beings who could challenge the new gods. Sooner or later, another threat would emerge. And when it did, Zeus would once again have to defend his throne. But that belongs to another story. For now, the heavens were quiet. The clouds moved slowly above the earth. The sea had settled. The mountains stood beneath the open sky. And Zeus looked across the world he had inherited. Perhaps this was the moment when he finally understood how far he had come. He had begun as a child who was never supposed to survive. Cronus had believed that swallowing his children would protect his throne. He had believed that the prophecy could be defeated. But Zeus survived. He grew. He returned. He freed his family. He gathered allies. And he challenged the Titans. The child who had once been hidden in a cave now ruled the heavens. The irony was impossible to miss. Cronus had feared Zeus because he believed his son would destroy him. And in the end, that fear had been correct. But there was another lesson hidden inside the story. Zeus did not simply defeat his father. He inherited his father's position. And that meant he inherited his father's problem. How do you remain powerful when everyone around you is also powerful? How do you keep a divine family united? How do you prevent another generation from rising against you? And how do you rule without becoming the very thing you once fought? Those questions would follow Zeus throughout the rest of his mythology. His reign would be filled with victories, but it would also be filled with arguments, challenges, punishments, promises, betrayals, and conflicts among the gods themselves. Zeus would become known as the king of the gods. But being king would never mean that everyone simply obeyed him. The gods had their own personalities, their own desires, their own powers. Even Zeus's brothers could disagree with him. His wife Hera would sometimes oppose him. His children would eventually become powerful gods in their own right. Olympus would become a place of both divine order and divine conflict. And that complicated world began here, with the fall of the Titans. The Titanomachy was therefore more than an ancient war. It was the mythological explanation for a change in cosmic power. It explained why the Olympians ruled, why Zeus held the heavens, why the Titans belonged to an older age, and why the gods worshipped by later generations were no longer the children of Cronus alone, but the rulers of a new divine order. For the ancient Greeks, these stories were not simply stories about distant beings. They were explanations. They helped people imagine where the world had come from, why storms existed, why the sea could be dangerous, why death belonged to another realm, why the gods had different powers, and why Zeus stood above them. Every thunderstorm could remind a person of the King of the heavens. Every flash of lightning could become a symbol of divine authority. The thunderbolt was no longer simply the weapon that had helped win a war. It had become the sign of Zeus himself, the weapon that announced his presence, the weapon that represented his power, and the weapon that reminded gods and mortals alike that the age of the Titans was over. Yet Zeus's greatest achievement was not the thunderbolt. It was survival. He survived the fear of Cronus. He survived the uncertainty of childhood. He survived the war, and he created a place where his generation could rule. The story had begun with a prophecy. A father terrified of his children, a mother trying to protect them, a child hidden from the ruler of the universe. And it ended with that child sitting upon the throne his father had once occupied. The cycle had turned. But it had also changed. Uranus had been overthrown by Cronus. Cronus had been overthrown by Zeus. The pattern suggested that every ruler would eventually fall. Every generation would eventually be replaced. But Zeus would try to create something different. He would build an order strong enough to survive. Whether he truly succeeded would become one of the great questions of Greek mythology, because the universe was never completely peaceful. There would be more enemies, more monsters, more rebellions, more challenges, and Zeus would have to face them. But tonight, we can leave the battlefield behind. The thunder has faded. The Titans are gone from the surface of the world. The ancient mountains have become still. The sea has returned to its rhythm. And above everything, the sky belongs to Zeus. The young god who was once hidden from his father has become the king of the gods. His thunderbolt rests in his hand. His kingdom stretches across the heavens, and below him lies a world that has only just entered a new age. The Olympians have arrived. The Titans belong to the past, and the reign of Zeus has begun. Perhaps somewhere deep beneath the earth, the ancient Titans still remember the world they once ruled. Perhaps Cronus remembers the throne he lost. Perhaps he remembers the prophecy, the child he feared, the son he tried to destroy, and perhaps he finally understands what he could never accept. The future cannot be swallowed. It cannot be imprisoned forever. It cannot be defeated simply because we fear what it might become. Zeus was the future Cronus had tried to prevent. And now, that future had become the present. The heavens grew darker. A distant flash of lightning appeared beyond the clouds. For a moment, the sky was illuminated. Then darkness returned. The storm moved farther away. The world became quiet again, and Zeus remained above it all. King, ruler, guardian of the heavens. The first great war of his reign was over. But his story was only beginning, because the throne he had won would soon attract new challengers. And the next enemies would not be the Titans. They would be something else. Something born from the ancient earth. Something powerful enough to make the new king fight once again for his crown. But that is a story for another night. For now, the age of the Titans has ended, and the age of Zeus has begun.